A duchess vanishes from a locked hotel room in Venice. No one sees her leave. Hours later, a ransom note, a bloodstained handkerchief, and whispers of wartime crimes resurface. But what if the mystery isn't about where she went, but what she came to reveal? This is a disappearance you won't forget. It was a night to unsettle even the most composed soul. A tempest had seized the Mediterranean with a vengeance rarely seen in late October. Waves battered the rocky shores below Villa Altamari like ancient gods in conflict, and the wind howled through olive groves as if mourning some buried truth. I remember clearly the firelight flickering in Poirot's sitting room aboard our modest train compartment, where we had retired with a chessboard and a bottle of fine Armagnac. That's when the telegram arrived, creased, rain-dampened, and bearing the ornate seal of Baroness Ginevra d'Alincourt, a name not uttered in civilized company for many years. I glanced at Poirot's expression as he read, and for the briefest of moments, something unfamiliar crossed his face. Not fear, not surprise, but a quiet, almost reverent concern. "We are summoned, Hastings," he murmured, placing the telegram down with unusual delicacy. "To Amalfi by a ghost." "A ghost?" I asked, chuckling awkwardly. Poirot did not smile. "Non, mon ami. Worse. A memory." The Villa Altamari stood like a silent sentinel above the waves, carved into the very cliffside, its weather-worn stones stained with salt and shadow. We arrived in the hush of twilight, the last rain clouds drifting away as if afraid to linger. An elderly butler with eyes like burnt glass greeted us with wordless solemnity and ushered us into a grand atrium where time seemed to have paused. A chandelier of blackened crystal swayed gently from the ceiling, its fragments whispering secrets with every movement. There, by the vast hearth, stood the Baroness, tall, impossibly pale, and draped in mourning silks despite the absence of a funeral. Her voice, when she spoke, was wind-chilled velvet. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I did not expect you would come in person." "Madam," Poirot bowed. "One does not ignore an echo that has grown louder with time." And then she said it, the line that would set the wheels of this tragedy in motion. "My son did not fall. He was pushed." Leonardo d'Alincourt had died a year ago, so the local whispers went, after a misstep along the cliffside promenade. A tragic accident, but the Baroness had never believed it, and now, on the eve of his birthday, she wished to prove it. She introduced us to those who had been in the villa that night, guests and family alike, all still here, still lingering like ghosts that had never quite left. There was Claudia, Leonardo's fiancée, whose smiles were too rehearsed and whose eyes flicked too often toward the sea. His cousin Matteo, a war-scarred poet who rarely spoke but whose journal hinted at buried resentments. The family priest, Father Beniamino, with his worn Bible and trembling hands. And finally, the enigmatic French governess, Mademoiselle Veronique, who claimed to have heard Leonardo's final scream from her window, but who had, curiously, done nothing. In the great hallway stood Leonardo's portrait, his eyes once painted with youth's promise, but now, somehow, altered. The left iris had been crudely scratched, as though by a nail in a fit of rage. Poirot stood silently before the canvas. "Regardez," he said, "the face remains, but the soul is at war." That night, a fire was lit in the villa's long-abandoned library. Hastings, was roused by the faint scent of ash. Poirot, already awake and immaculately dressed, beckoned me to follow the trail of soot down the marbled corridor. We found the library unlocked, the door swinging like a breath. Inside, someone had unearthed an old bundle of letters, partially burned, tucked behind a false panel in the fireplace. They spoke of betrayal, of debts, of a love triangle far uglier than anyone had suspected. One letter in particular bore the Baroness's handwriting, begging Leonardo to reconsider his engagement, lest you seal your fate to a woman whose past is as false as her name. Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. The seeds were sown not in murder, Hastings, but in deception. We must only follow the roots. The morning brought no sun, only gray mist coiling around the villa like a serpent. Over breakfast, Poirot asked each guest to describe the night of Leonardo's death. There were contradictions, of course, minor details misplaced or confused. But it was the music box that caught Poirot's attention. Claudia had claimed it played the couple's favorite waltz at exactly 10 that night, echoing through the courtyard. Yet the box, when Poirot examined it, was rusted shut. "Time, it seems," he said softly, "has not passed for this mechanism, and yet the lie has danced freely." The silence that followed was heavy with dread. Later that day, Poirot requested to see the old family chapel nestled beneath the cliffs, accessible only by a winding stair. Father Beniamino hesitated, but led us there. What we found chilled the spine. Behind the altar, a hidden door revealed a crypt, sealed since the days of Leonardo's grandfather. And there, beneath sheets of dust, was a box, small, locked, and stained. Inside, a blood-streaked handkerchief, a silver cufflink engraved with Leonardo's initials and the governess's rosary. Veronique fainted before she could speak a word. The drawing room that evening felt like a theater awaiting its final act. Poirot gathered them all, Claudia, Matteo, Father Beniamino, the Baroness, and stood calmly by the hearth. "The truth, Mes Amos, is like the sea," he said. "It hides beneath its surface wrecks, anchors, bones, but eventually it brings everything ashore." He began to reveal the web. Leonardo had discovered Claudia's secret, a previous marriage annulled under false names. He had threatened to call it off, to expose everything. Matteo, jealous and burdened by unspoken debts, saw his cousin's death as salvation. But it was Veronique, blackmailed by Leonardo for something she'd hidden long ago, who had taken the fatal step, or rather, the fatal push. But she was not the only one at fault, Poirot concluded. Each of you played your part, in deceit, in silence, in cowardice. The Baroness stood on the cliff's edge the next morning, dressed not in morning black, but a deep melancholic blue. "You've given me answers, Monsieur Poirot," she said, "but peace is not so obedient." Poirot only bowed. "Justice rarely comforts, madam. It merely restores the balance." As we departed Villa Altamari, I turned one last time to see the sea crash against the rocks, as if trying to reach the secrets still buried deep within the stone. Some mysteries, I realized, do not end, they echo, and in the echo they endure. It was the sort of evening that seemed more dream than dusk, where the fog rising off the Venetian canals wove itself into the architecture of the city, turning bridges to phantoms and towers to silhouettes. Hercule Poirot and I had arrived only that morning, intending nothing more sinister than a quiet week among galleries and cafes. The invitation, handwritten and faintly perfumed, had come from Lady Araminta Carlyle, an Englishwoman of wealth and widowhood who had retired to the crumbling Palazzo San Martino with her younger companion and a menagerie of guests. The palazzo was a magnificent decay of history, walls the color of burnt rose, windows latticed with iron ivy, and a bell tower long disused save for a curious local tradition. Once a year, on the winter solstice, a single chime was sounded at midnight. Lady Araminta had invited us to witness the occasion. Poirot, never one to refuse the peculiar or the aristocratic, accepted with the faintest of amused sighs. I remember the atmosphere in the grand dining hall that night, candles guttering in silver sconces, tapestries stirring though no breeze touched them. The guests were few but striking. Mrs. Old Drake, an angular music tutor whose gloved hands never ceased trembling. Colonel Wentworth, a man whose mustache was as rigid as his opinions. Signora Beatrice Rossetti, a fading opera diva with a penchant for midnight walks. And the elusive companion, Miss Elodie Vane, young, pale, and unfathomably still. When the bell struck 12, one long, hollow note, it came not from the tower, but from somewhere within the house. We rose as one, some with surprise, others with fear. Poirot alone remained seated, his gaze fixed not on the room, but on the darkened corridor beyond. The silence that followed the toll was total. Then came the scream. It echoed from the upper floors, thin and distant. I was already halfway to the staircase before I realized Poirot had not moved. "Let them go," he said quietly. "We will go when the second scream comes." I turned back, startled. "You expect another?" "I do not expect," he replied, rising at last. "I deduce." And as if summoned by his words, it came, shorter, sharper, This one not of fear, but of rage. We ascended to the belfry, that forgotten tower that loomed above the lagoon like a relic of judgment. There, beneath a shattered pane, lay Colonel Wentworth. The blood from his temple had begun to cool against the ancient stone. Miss Drake fainted. The bell, untouched for years, swayed lightly on its chain. Lady Araminta insisted the body not be removed until Poirot had examined it. Her calm was uncanny. "One does not invite a mind such as yours for conversation alone, monsieur," she said, sipping from a glass of brandy. "I am not so naive as to mistake coincidence for fate." Poirot nodded gravely and turned to the room. "No one is to leave the palazzo." In the hours that followed, we learned that Colonel Wentworth had quarreled with nearly every guest. His disdain was not subtle, and his opinions were often dressed as insults. But Poirot was less interested in enmities than in patterns. He asked about the bell, who had access to the mechanism, who had keys to the tower, and, curiously, who among them could read music. "You believe this was orchestrated?" I asked. Poirot tapped his nose. "Mais oui, Hastings. Murder is not merely a deed, it is a composition." Poirot requested to examine the late colonel's possessions. Among them he found a diary, meticulously kept, save for the last 2 weeks, which were entirely blank. "Something changed," Poirot murmured. "A man does not abandon habit without cause." We interviewed Miss Rossetti in the music room, where she spoke not of the colonel, but of the palazzo. "It was once a convent, did you know?" she said. "They say the last abbess went mad and rang the bell until her hands bled." "A charming legend," Poirot replied, "but it is the present ghosts that concern me." Miss Vane, the companion, remained elusive. She avoided direct answers, gave half-smiles that seemed stitched from politeness, and recoiled whenever the bell tower was mentioned. Poirot watched her with increasing intensity. It was on the 3rd day that the envelope arrived, sealed in red wax, addressed to Poirot, and slipped beneath the door of our shared suite. Inside was a single phrase: "Ask her about the window." That afternoon, Poirot brought Lady Araminta to the belfry. "You said no one uses this place, yet there is a fresh footprint in the dust." She raised an eyebrow. "You presume it was not the colonel?" Poirot smiled. He wore brogues. "This is a lady's slipper, a narrow one, and it paused by the broken window before the bell rang." She did not reply. Poirot did not press. In the dead of night, Poirot took me to the tower again. "Bring no candle," he whispered. "Let the house see only its own shadows." There, in the dark, he tapped along the wall until a hollow sound replied. A hidden alcove. Inside, a folded sheet of music, titled "The Bell of San Martino." Beneath the notes was scrawled a line in Italian. "Il sang non dimentica." Blood does not forget. The paper was old, but the ink was fresh. The next morning, Poirot asked all guests to assemble in the drawing-room. Miss Vane arrived last, her eyes hollow. Poirot began gently. "Mademoiselle, you once trained as a concert pianist, did you not?" She flinched. "I briefly." "You composed that music," he said. "The music that sounded at midnight. A melody not of bells, but of vengeance." She collapsed into the chair. The truth tumbled out in fragments. She had once been engaged to the colonel's son. A love affair that ended in scandal and exile when the colonel accused her of theft. Her reputation ruined, she had taken refuge with Lady Araminta, who knew the story, and who, Poirot suspected, had planned this entire gathering to provoke justice. "I only meant for him to hear the bell," Elodie whispered. Not to die." "But someone," Poirot said softly, "used your performance as cover." It was Lady Araminta who had orchestrated it all. Her son had taken his life shortly after marrying Elodie in secret. The colonel had blackmailed him into annulment. Araminta had carried her grief in silence until the opportunity arose. She had invited them all, fed the drama, set the stage. But it was Miss Drake who had pushed the colonel in the belfry. Once Elodie played the bell tone, Drake, his former mistress, acted on her own wrath. Poirot explained it all calmly, without triumph. This was not murder, he concluded. It was a requiem, each note played in grief, each silence echoing judgment. The authorities came. The palazzo emptied. Lady Araminta stood on the dock, veiled and unrepentant. "You see, Monsieur Poirot," she said, "some ghosts must be answered, or they never stop ringing." He bowed to her. "But justice, madam, is a melody best played by honest hands." And as we departed through the misted canal, the bell rang once more, low, distant, and final. It began on a night when the moon hung low over Lake Como, its pale silver reflection rippling like whispered secrets across the water. Hercule Poirot, resplendent in a dove-gray suit and a silk cravat of pale lavender, was taking coffee beneath the colonnade of the Grand Hotel di Bellagio. It was late June, and though the hour was past 10, the air held the soft warmth of a Mediterranean evening. The sound of distant laughter carried over the gardens, and from a far salon came the gentle strains of a nocturne played too hesitantly to be professional. Poirot's tranquility was disturbed not by the music, but by a curious encounter. A woman, of vision in ivory lace, her eyes shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, emerged from the shadows of the garden path and approached the table where he sat. She paused for a moment, as if measuring the resolve to speak. Then she whispered, "Monsieur Poirot, if you value life and truth, do not let the Countess sail tomorrow." Before he could rise, before he could even ask her name, she vanished back into the dark like a wisp of lake mist. Poirot stared after her, his brows drawn in curiosity, and though he had no acquaintance with any countess, by morning her name would become known to the world in connection with a most sinister affair. The Countess Aurelia di Serrano, widow to a Milanese industrialist and known patroness of the arts, was due to depart by private yacht the next morning. She was staying in the villa annex of the Grand Hotel, a restored Renaissance manor perched like a swan's nest upon the lake. Poirot received a summons with breakfast, a crisply folded note delivered by glove concierge. "Your presence is requested at the Villa di Serrano. Urgently. A matter of discretion and importance." Signed only with the initial A. He arrived to find the villa in disarray. Servants stood idle, eyes wide with the peculiar stillness of disbelief. In the salon, richly paneled in cherry wood and frescoed with faded cherubs, the body of Countess Aurelia was discovered upon a divan, her head tilted back unnaturally, as if listening to the ceiling. A silk scarf of peacock blue was knotted about her throat. No sign of forced entry. No valuables disturbed. Only a shattered porcelain music box on the floor beneath her fingers, and the scent of heliotrope in the air. The Countess had hosted a supper the previous evening. 5 guests were present. Mr. Felix Harrow, a cynical art dealer from London with debts as deep as his charm. Madame Laurette Myritt, an aging opera singer whose beauty had faded but whose voice still commanded awe. Captain Aldo Bellanti, a decorated naval officer with a temper as precise as his uniform. Julia Serrano, the Countess's estranged niece, returned after a decade abroad. Dr. Paul Vernier, a Parisian physician and the Countess's reputed confidant. All claimed to have retired at midnight. Yet Poirot, examining the scene with fastidious care, noted 3 things. A broken heel beneath the settee, a goblet of untouched wine, except for a faint trace of lipstick, and a painting turned askew on the far wall. He said nothing. Not yet. Julia was the first to crack. Poirot found her that afternoon pacing the Oleander Walk. "You think I had reason," she said abruptly, without preamble. "I did. She disinherited me. Publicly. Cruelly. Said I lacked character. But I did not kill her." Poirot offered no judgment, only a gentle question. "And what of love, mademoiselle? Did you lack that too?" Tears gathered behind her lashes. She loved nothing. Not truly. Not even my father. That evening, a servant found Madame Myritt unconscious in her room, an overdose of laudanum at her bedside. A note on monogrammed paper read, "I dream of aria and silence. I did not kill her, but I too am dead in the heart." Poirot requested the villa's old music room be opened. It had been closed since the Count's death, years before. Inside, time hung thick, moth-eaten sheet music, a cracked metronome ticking wildly when touched, and mirrors, every wall reflecting itself into eternity. On the music stand, Poirot found a page, an aria composed by Aurelia herself. In the margin, a smear of ink and the words, "Truth comes in fragments." From behind one mirror, Poirot uncovered a hidden door. It led to a narrow passage ending in a small antechamber overlooking the salon. A spy's nest. Someone had watched her die. The yacht remained moored, its sails furled like folded wings. Captain Belanti swore he had orders to depart by dawn. But from whom? Asked Poirot. The captain faltered. She left a message with my valet. Said plans had changed. Poirot confronted the valet. The boy blushed and confessed. No message had come. But he had seen someone slip aboard the night before. The art dealer, Harrow. Under questioning, Harrow admitted he had tried to steal a jeweled brooch from the Countess's collection. But when I reached her, he confessed bitterly, she was already dead. Poirot gathered them all in the villa's candlelit salon. The wind from the lake sighed through the shutters. I have been most troubled by this case, he began, his eyes flicking from face to face. Because it is not merely a murder. It is a story of love, wounded, desperate, and afraid. He turned to Dr. Vernier. You loved her. The doctor bowed his head. For years. She would never admit it. Said love was weakness. But that night, she asked me to stay. Poirot nodded. And you did. In the shadows. Watching. Knowing she meant to destroy someone's life, that evening with a letter she never posted. He held up the torn remains of the letter, retrieved from the music box. And so, you chose silence. You left her there, alone, thinking to save her dignity. But another came. Madame Myritt. A gasp. No, said the singer weakly from her chair. Poirot raised a brow. You did not kill her, but you confronted her. She mocked you. Threw your last aria in the fire. You slapped her. She fell. The scarf caught. An accident, but you fled instead of helping. A silence fell heavy. Yet, Poirot continued, his voice low. It was not murder. It was cowardice. It was pride. And pride, M.E.S. Amos, kills more surely than daggers. Poirot stood that evening at the villa's edge, watching the moon return to the lake. The police had come and gone. No arrests were made. No charges filed. There would be whispers, perhaps even headlines. But the law, in this case, was a poor vessel for truth. He turned to Hastings, who had joined him late from Milan. Will you write this one? He asked softly. Hastings shook his head. Too sad. Poirot's gaze lingered on the water. Yes, he said, but it is the sadness that tells us we are human. The moon shivered over the lake, and somewhere far behind them, the broken music box played one last note. It was upon the dying breath of a Venetian twilight that the letter arrived, unannounced and signed, and heavy with the scent of something long buried. Poirot and I had taken temporary residence at the Palazzo Belladonna, a faded jewel of patrician decadence nestled between canals swollen with secrets. The letter, handed to Poirot by a mute chambermaid, bore only a single line in careful script. She walks again where she once wept. Beneath it, an address, Villa Medora, Torcello. I expected Poirot to scoff at the melodrama, yet he folded the letter with uncanny gravity. Mon ami, he said, we are summoned, not by coincidence, but by consequence. The next morning, under skies bruised with incoming rain, we boarded a private watercraft. Torcello awaited, a marshy isle haunted by abandoned chapels and the whisper of ancient bells. The villa stood in hushed isolation, ivy-choked and sleeping behind wrought-iron gates. It had the air of a house recently awakened from its own funeral. We were received by Madame Isolde Laroche, a widow of considerable hauteur, who welcomed us with a restraint that verged on resignation. Her voice, like her mourning gown, carried a dignity steeped in sorrow. You have come about my daughter, Celeste, she said without preamble. She has returned, I believe, to torment the living. But, madam, I protested, surely your daughter is dead. Yes, 10 years now. But her room is no longer as we left it. Last night, the scent of violets returned, her favorite perfume, and her portrait it wept. Poirot said nothing at first. He moved through the room with his signature delicacy, examining each corner as though listening for the architecture itself to confess. Finally, he turned to her. Madam, you believe someone seeks to conjure her presence. Or perhaps obscure a newer crime with an older ghost. Her lips trembled. You will understand when you see her room. The room in question had been sealed, locked by Isolde herself every year on Celeste's death anniversary. Yet when she opened it this morning, she found the air freshly disturbed. The perfume, unmistakably floral, lingered like a memory refusing to fade. And on the vanity, a locket, once buried with Celeste, now rested upon a folded silk handkerchief embroidered with a single crimson thread. Poirot examined the room meticulously. The window was latched from the inside. No signs of forced entry. Yet the dust had been shifted, the bedding subtly rumpled, and the wardrobe door left ajar, revealing a single absent dress, a lavender gown known from old photographs to be Celeste's favorite. "It is most irregular," Poirot murmured. "It is not the ghost we pursue, Hastings. It is the illusion of one." We took tea with the household, the silent groundskeeper Mateo, the governess Miss Denham, whose posture was ramrod even in relaxation, and Father Tomas, the village priest who had known Celeste since birth. "It is grief, surely," Miss Denham insisted. "Madame has never truly recovered. I've heard her speaking to shadows." "And yet," Father Tomas added solemnly, "there is something unsettled about this land, this house. The bell of San Fosca rings at odd hours, and always, always before a death." Poirot's gaze lingered on the priest. "You believe death walks here, Father?" "No," the priest said, "but I believe someone wishes us to believe it does." The discovery came by accident, or rather, by design, as Poirot later revealed. Beneath the loose floorboard in Celeste's room, Hastings and I found a box of letters, unsent, unsigned, unread, all addressed to a B. Each spoke of entrapment, of longing, of betrayal. "Read between the lines, Hastings," Poirot said, tapping the parchment. "The ink may be dry, but the wound is fresh. Celeste loved someone she could not name, someone who returned that love, poorly. Do you suspect the groundskeeper? Too rustic, too obvious. No, this is the work of someone who masks violence with poetry." That night, Poirot conducted an experiment. He asked Madame Laroche to light a candle in Celeste's room and leave the door slightly ajar. He remained within, silent, still, for nearly 2 hours. Then, just past midnight, the candle extinguished, not by wind, but by a deliberate breath. He emerged pale, shaken. "She is not dead, Hastings," he said. "Or if she is, then someone seeks to revive her legend as pretext for what? Murder? Madness. What did you see?" I asked. Not what I saw, but what I heard. Footsteps. Familiar. Measured. They stopped at the mirror. And then, he paused. She whispered my name. Poirot requested the family's heirlooms be brought forth. Among them, a music box that once belonged to Celeste. When wound, it played a fractured lullaby. Poirot dismantled it carefully, and within the velvet lining, he found a photograph. 2 women. One was Celeste. The other, unmistakably, Miss Denham, though a decade younger and without the rigidity that now defined her. She was her lover, Poirot said quietly. They quarreled. Celeste disappeared. The letters were never mailed. Miss Denham remained, waiting for a ghost. The revelation broke Miss Denham's composure. In the dead hush of that same night, she entered Poirot's salon uninvited. Her eyes were wild, her fingers trembling. "I tried to bury it," she confessed. "The shame, the love. But she came back. Or someone wants her too. You did not kill her?" Poirot asked gently. "No. She left. Ran away. I let them all believe she drowned." "Why return now?" "I think she never left. I think she watches us. From the chapel. From the shadows." At dawn, Poirot demanded the chapel be opened. Beneath the floorboards, he found what the priest had long suspected but never dared voice aloud. A second burial. Unmarked. Hidden. Celeste. A faded lavender gown. A rusted locket. And in her hand, one final letter, unfinished. To be. Poirot wept then. Silently. Profoundly. Miss Denham did not run. Nor did she protest as the police arrived. She only asked one thing of Poirot. Read the letter aloud. He did. "I love you." It ended. But I fear what you may do when the world refuses us. Poirot folded the letter. It was not a crime of hatred, he said, but of despair. And in the silence that followed, the bells of San Fosca rang once more. Not for death, but for forgiveness. It began, as such stories often do, with an invitation cloaked in civility, yet edged with urgency. The letter, penned in a delicate, sweeping hand, arrived with the morning post at Poirot's lodgings in Florence. It bore the seal of the Marchesa di San Severina, a name once familiar in the corridors of Parisian society, now rarely uttered outside of hushed gossip. "My dear Monsieur Poirot," it read, "your discretion is renowned, your brilliance beyond contest. Come to Villa Morella at once. There's been a situation. I fear for the consequences should the truth remain buried." Poirot, whose little gray cells, stirred not just for crimes, but for curiosities, summoned me at once. "Hastings, my friend, pack lightly, but with haste. We go where shadows lengthen in the sun, where the past walks quietly behind lace curtains." The Villa Morella stood on a cliff overlooking the Gulf of Poets. Its facade faded like a memory, but with a grandeur that resisted decay. We arrived at dusk. The sea below murmured secrets to the rocks. The Marchesa awaited us in a salon that smelled faintly of lavender and varnish. Her age showed in her eyes more than her skin. "He is dead, Monsieur Poirot. My nephew, Arturo. And though they call it an accident, my heart tells me it is not so." Arturo di San Severina, only 27, had been heir to the family title and fortune. He was found lifeless in his study, slumped before a half-finished portrait he had been painting obsessively for weeks. No wounds, no signs of violence, only an untouched glass of wine by his elbow and the faintest trace of a bitter almond scent in the air. "The doctors say it was his heart," said Lucia, Arturo's fiancée, with a voice as brittle as the teacup in her hand. But Arturo's heart was strong. He swam every morning in the cove. Poirot paced the study. The room bore no struggle, only silence and shadows. The portrait was curious, a woman, not Lucia, staring outward with eyes that seemed to accuse. The brushwork around the mouth was unfinished, as though halted by a sudden tremor. "You see, Hastings," Poirot murmured, "here we have a man who dies quietly, yet not naturally. A portrait of a woman he will not name, and a villa where even the walls listen." Villa Morella housed more than sorrow. There was Sophia, Arturo's sister, who wandered its halls like a spectre, murmuring half-verses of opera. Dr. Lorenzo Bellini, a family friend and physician, who declared Arturo's death natural with surprising haste. And old Signor Conti, the caretaker, whose eyes never left the cliffs when the sun dipped low. Poirot interviewed them each beneath the fading frescoes of the drawing-room. "Arturo changed after he returned from Paris," said Sophia, her hands wrapped tightly around a shawl. "He grew secretive, distant. Sometimes I'd find him staring at the sea for hours. Once, I saw him burn a letter in the fireplace." Dr. Bellini, a man of heavy jowls and quick temper, dismissed the notion of foul play. "Poison. Nonsense. The boy was under great strain. The inheritance, the engagement, the responsibility, it was too much." And yet, Poirot mused later, the wine was untouched. A man under strain drinks, Hastings. He does not paint a ghost and die quietly at its feet. It was the portrait that revealed the first true crack. A visiting art historian, summoned by Poirot, declared it not an original but a copy of a woman painted long ago, Isabella Rossellini, a muse from 1911, who vanished after a scandal involving a Parisian diplomat. That diplomat, none other than Arturo's grandfather. "So the past returns," Poirot said, his mustaches twitching, "but not as memory, as retribution." A hidden drawer in Arturo's bureau yielded letters, pages written in French, dated 3 months prior, and signed only as I. "You owe them the truth." One read, "Or I shall come myself." Another, more recent, "I will arrive on the full moon. I expect you to have spoken by then." The date of the full moon, the night Arturo died. Poirot requested a reenactment of that final evening. All guests assembled on the terrace, where Arturo had last been seen alive. The sea below glittered with moonlight. Candles flickered. Truths, like wine, began to spill. Lucia snapped first. He was going to call off the wedding. I saw the letters. He said he had found someone else, someone he wronged. Dr. Bellini leaned forward. He was obsessed, not in love. Obsessed with history, with guilt he inherited. He was unraveling. Poirot turned to the Marchesa. And you, madam, you knew of your husband's scandal, did you not? You feared it would destroy what name remained. She stood with difficulty. I did what any mother would. I begged Arturo to remain silent, but he refused. He said he must end the curse. Poirot requested all guests remain at the villa overnight. In Arturo's study, he studied the fireplace ashes. He found the faint outline of a signet ring, burned parchment bearing its imprint. Hastings, my friend, he said, I believe our Arturo did not die by another's hand, but by his own, under the weight of truth too long hidden. But the mystery did not end. Who was I? And why no farewell? At dawn, the answer came, not in words but in presence. A woman arrived by sea, elderly, veiled, and quiet. She bore with her a single photograph, a young girl beside a smiling man in diplomatic dress. Isabella Rossellini, Poirot said softly. She handed him a sealed envelope. He was my son. He wrote to me. I came as he asked. Too late. The letter, read aloud in the salon, chilled the soul. To whom it may concern, the sins of the father are not always buried with him. I carry the shame of what was done to Isabella. She loved truly, and was discarded like dust in scandal's wind. And I, Arturo di Sanseverina, bear that legacy. I met her again, 3 months ago. Her face aged, her grace not. I knew then what had to be done, to name the truth, even if it destroyed us all. But cowardice, that is a slow poison. I feared what would follow. The shame, the unraveling. I saw no way forward. Forgive me. Silence followed. In the days that followed, Villa Morella grew quieter. Lucia left for Milan. The engagement ring returned. Dr. Bellini resigned his post. The Marchesa spent her hours walking the cliffs, her figure distant against the rising sun. Isabella, whose truth had arrived too late, lit a single candle in the chapel each night before returning to the mainland. Poirot and I departed soon after. As we boarded the train at La Spezia, he turned to me, eyes distant. There are crimes of law, Hastings, and crimes of the heart. Arturo committed neither, and both. Sometimes, justice is not in punishment, but in revelation. The train pulled away, the sea glittering behind us. The portrait of Isabella remained in the villa, restored and ensigned. And in the hush of evening, when the moonlight kissed the cliffs, some say her voice could be heard still, singing a lullaby once meant for a son never claimed. Venice, in late autumn, is a city of sighs and secrets. The fog clings like faded lace to the old stones of the palazzos, and every ripple in the water seems to whisper something forgotten. It was on such a night, when the bells of San Pietro tolled a hollow midnight, that Hercule Poirot arrived at the Convento di Sant'Alma, a place not listed in any guidebook, and all the more curious for it. The convent, no longer in use by any holy order, had been purchased and converted into a private retreat by the Marchesa di Rovigno, a woman of particular repute and even more particular tastes. She had invited a select group of guests for what she called a soirée of reflection and beauty. Poirot was among them, ostensibly to enjoy the cultural company. But as he would soon learn, not all who arrived would leave untouched by the past. The guests were few, but curious. There was Colonel Eddings, a retired British officer with a waxed mustache and eyes that never quite rested. Lady Celestine Vale, famed for her Grecian profiles and infamous for her late husband's gambling debts. A quiet German historian named her Falk, and a pale young woman, Isidora Montaldi, whose voice was barely louder than the rustle of the silk scarves she always wore at her neck. Poirot, ever meticulous, observed the way the Marchesa moved among them, charming, coaxing, listening. She asked unusual questions over dinner, about memory, about betrayal, about beauty in the face of ruin. Later that evening, As a pale moon shivered over the lagoon, she took Poirot aside. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low and accented like a forgotten aria, "I did not invite you merely for your company. I believe someone intends to kill me." The next morning, the Marchesa was found dead in the room she called La Stanza degli Specchi, the room of mirrors. It was locked from the inside. Her body, clothed in a silvery gown, lay beneath the shattered Venetian mirror. No wound, no blood, only a look of horror on her face, and an ancient book of sonnets clutched to her chest. Inspector Bellanti of the Venice police, a man of brusque temper and spotless gloves, was summoned. He frowned at Poirot's presence, but begrudgingly allowed him to assist. Poirot, for his part, stood long before the broken mirror. "Mon ami Hastings," he murmured to me, as I scribbled furiously in my notebook, "the question is not how she died, but what she saw." The book of sonnets proved to be no idle poetry. Between its pages were annotations in the Marchesa's own hand, and a cipher constructed from underlined letters. It spoke of a betrayal long buried, a painting smuggled out of Florence during the war, thought lost. The Marchesa had tracked it, and someone had learned of her pursuit. Lady Celestine claimed ignorance. Her Falk turned pale at the mention of war-era art. Colonel Eddings grew tight-lipped and retreated to long walks in the fog. But it was Isidora whose hands trembled most, and who refused to speak of her father, once a military attaché to Mussolini himself. Poirot, ever the psychologist, examined the convent's walls as carefully as its occupants. Hidden behind a fresco in the library, he discovered a concealed compartment containing a faded letter and an old photograph. The Marchesa, much younger, standing with a man in German uniform, and a small child with haunting eyes. The letter, once translated, confirmed his growing suspicion. The Marchesa had not always been di Rovigno. During the war, she had fled under another name. The painting she sought had belonged to her family. It had been taken by someone she now dined with. That evening, Poirot gathered the guests in the old chapel. The stained glass glowed with moonlight, the shadows bent like supplicants. He spoke gently, with precision. The Marchesa did not fear death. She feared silence. She feared the truth would remain hidden. But no, it will not, for I have found it. And then he turned to Isidora. Her confession came like falling rain, soft, inevitable, full of grief. The Marchesa was her mother. She had come not as a guest, but as a last attempt at reconciliation. She had discovered her father's role in the wartime thefts. The painting her mother sought was in their villa, hidden for decades. But when her mother confronted her with the truth, Isidora panicked. She fled. She heard the crash of the mirror from the corridor. But she had not killed her. Poirot nodded. "You speak the truth. But the mirror, it was no accident." Colonel Eddings had been quiet too long. Poirot confronted him with the cipher, the letter, and the photograph. The colonel, it turned out, had been posted in Florence during the war, tasked with recovering endangered art. He had sold the painting to fund an escape. He had believed it buried forever. "She found out," Poirot said. "She confronted you. And in the mirror, she saw the truth of what you had done. You did not strike her, Colonel, but you broke that mirror in rage. And in it, she saw herself not as a Marchesa, but as a widow of the truth. Her heart, already weak, could bear no more." The colonel said nothing, but the silence was enough. Days later, the guests departed. The convent stood quiet once more, its secrets bared. Poirot remained behind for one final walk, through its corridors. "So much sorrow hidden beneath marble," he said to me. "So many faces reflected in shattered glass. Do you think she forgave her daughter?" Poirot paused. "I believe she already had. It was herself she could not forgive." He placed a white lily on the mirror's remains. "Venice keeps her secrets, Hastings. But with a little order, a little method, even silence can be made to speak." It began on a winter's evening in Florence, beneath the hush of falling snow. A letter arrived at Poirot's lodgings, elegant script, fragrant with bergamot. "Monsieur Poirot, a matter of utmost delicacy. My husband has vanished. Please come discreetly to Villa Lucenti. Signora Adriana Morini." We found the villa perched above the Arno, its stone walls frosted with snow. Inside, Signora Morini awaited, grief and resolve interwoven in her tear-streaked cheeks. "He disappeared last night," she said. "The door locked from within. I fear something darker." Poirot's gaze, thoughtful and probing, lingered on the faint candlelight reflecting in the arched windows. "We shall illuminate what lurks in the shadows," he replied softly. The next morning revealed more than absence. In the study where Signora Morini had last been seen, the desk drawer was open and empty save for a ledger, its pages scrawled with entries revealing mysterious payments to names unknown, dated during wartime. A gold signet ring lay abandoned on the floor, dented and tarnished. Inspector Bellucci, courteous but pragmatic, had declared no crime, just disappearance until further proof. Yet Poirot's little gray cells stirred. A ledger tells the tale not of deeds done yesterday, but those hidden long ago, he mused to Hastings. We must find both signer and signature. Our next meeting was with Marco, villa retainer and gardener, who had been cursed with silence since Signora Morini's last gala. He beckoned us into the garden beneath leafless cypress, his hand shaking as he offered a folded note. "Meet me at midnight by the fountain." It was unsigned. Marco said only, "I found it in his desk. He placed it there himself." Poirot pressed gently, but the man's silence remained unbroken. At the stroke of 12, Poirot and I slipped into the garden. The fountain, frozen over, glistened in moonlight. A figure emerged, draped in dark coat and hat, face hidden. At Poirot's greeting, the stranger remained still. Then, from his pocket, he produced a single page torn from the ledger, stained with a single drop of red wine. "I was told to deliver this," he whispered. But then he was gone. He fled before names could be questioned. Poirot pocketed the page. "Observe, Hastings, clues are seldom given so freely. They are dropped to be found when one is ready to see." That day, examining the ledger by firelight, Poirot discovered encrypted initials, AM again. Beneath each a location, Prague, Budapest, Vienna. Collections moved in the war through art smugglers and diplomats. Signora Morini, it seemed, had kept records someone else wanted suppressed. The missing nightshirt of the villa's cook, still bearing the scent of perfume, suggested a woman's presence. Yet no woman claimed to have visited. Late afternoon brought a breakthrough. In the salon, Poirot sniffed the air. "Lilac," he murmured. "Unusual in winter." Indeed, a single purple petal lay by the fireplace. A gardener later confessed to removing cuttings from a single branch near the path, truncated the night before disappearance. Poirot placed a call to Marco's compatriot in town, a florist. The association, lavender oil, lilac petals, evening rituals, and one name, Emilia Mariani, Signora Morini's cousin, absent from the guest list, but present in her husband's secret ledger. We found Emilia lodgings miles away, in a boarding house. She admitted visiting the villa that night, but only to plead. "He promised we would be partners," she confessed. Partners in scandal, or in justice. She had discovered the ledger and came to ask him to destroy it. He refused. They quarreled. She turned away. And later, she said only, with haunted voice. There was silence. Poirot took her hand gently. "Mademoiselle, you did not silence him, but another may have." He extracted a note from his coat, a ransom note demanding large sum to return Signora Morini. Back at the villa, Poirot assembled all, Signora Morini, Emilia, Marco, Inspector Bellucci, and the reticent gardener. In the study, under the glimmer of candlelight, Poirot recounted the ledger, payments meant to fund long-buried claims, restitution to families looted during war, the ransom, a ploy by those threatened by exposure. The real culprit, Signora Morini, displaced by guilt, staged his disappearance and ransom to protect Emilia's illicit but revelatory campaign. His guilt was not of theft, Poirot concluded, but of love and fear. Fear of those who would profit from obscurity. He has hidden in plain sight. Emilia gasped. He fled to protect me. At the sound of footsteps, the garden door swung open. There he stood, Signora Morini, frail but alive, trembling with tears. "I could not let them destroy her," he whispered. In the days that followed, The villa grew peaceful. The ransom note was traced to an art broker long known to both husband and wife. No crime was charged. The truth, once revealed, held justice in its light. On the final night, Poirot and I walked beneath the moonlit portico. "Mon ami," he said softly, "justice is more than punishment. It is revelation, letting shadows be seen in daylight." "And what of love?" I asked. He looked toward the villa. "Love is forgiveness, even when it binds us to silence." The bells of Florence rang midnight as we returned to our lodgings. Another case closed. Another lesson learned in the quiet dignity of truth. It was a bleak November evening when the letter arrived, delivered by hand, sealed with a blood-red wax crest bearing the emblem of a raven in flight. Hercule Poirot turned it over with interest as the fireplace crackled gently at our London lodgings. I, Captain Hastings, stood at the window watching the fog roll over the Thames like a funeral shroud. "Monsieur Poirot, you are respectfully invited to Ravenwell Hall for the commemoration of the late Colonel Ambrose Gethren. An incident has occurred, one which I believe only your particular talents may resolve. Cordelia Gethren." "Curious," Poirot murmured. "A commemoration of the dead, and yet the tone, Hastings. It hints at something unresolved, something alive." We arrived 2 days later at Ravenwell Hall, an austere estate perched atop moorlands in Northumberland, its stone facade blackened by time and weather. The hall sat like a mausoleum amidst the heather, its windows dark and narrow like watching eyes. Lady Cordelia Gethren, widow of the late colonel, received us with trembling poise. Her hands were gloved though indoors, and her voice carried a tremor. "It happened 3 nights ago," she said, leading us through echoing corridors to the drawing room. During the family gathering for the colonel's memorial, someone attempted to break into his study. The door was locked. No one had touched it since he passed. And yet the ledger, the only thing he kept under lock and key, is missing. Poirot's eyes flickered. "And the colonel died how?" "By his own hand. Or so the coroner ruled. But I have never believed it." Colonel Ambrose Gethren had been a man of discipline, legacy, and severe silence. His study remained untouched, dust still resting undisturbed on the mantel, save for a single set of footprints leading to the desk. The window latch bore fresh scratches. The safe beneath the floorboards was ajar. The ledger gone. Poirot examined everything with feline delicacy. "There's more here than absence," he murmured. "There's memory." On the floor lay a torn scrap of parchment, the corner of a military map, annotated in fading pencil. "Raven's Nest, May 1916. "Raven's Nest," I echoed. "Sounds poetic." "Non Hastings," Poirot said gravely. "It sounds like a code." That evening we met the family. Julian Gethren, the cold-eyed eldest son, Arabella, the embittered daughter who had once been disinherited, Reverend Claude Gethren, the late colonel's younger brother, and a distant cousin, Eleanor March, who spoke rarely but observed everything. Each claimed ignorance of the break-in, yet each had reason to covet what the colonel had kept secret, particularly Julian, who stood to inherit the estate in full, but whose finances were rumored to be strained. When asked about Raven's Nest, none could, or would, speak of it, except one. Later that night, Reverend Claude took Poirot aside. "Raven's Nest," he said quietly, "was not a place. It was an operation. During the Great War. Ambrose was part of it. It's why he could never sleep soundly again." In the small hours of morning, Poirot summoned me. "The colonel," he said, "did not die by his own hand." "What makes you so sure?" He held up the colonel's military-issue revolver, retrieved that day from a display case. It had not been fired in years, but the coroner's report said it was the weapon used. "Then what was?" "A .32 caliber pistol. Common, untraceable, and not his." He glanced toward the window where mist coiled over the moor. "It is a curious thing, Hastings. Those who die with secrets often leave them in whispers. Tonight we follow them." Lady Cordelia's eyes glistened as Poirot laid out the contradictions. She did not faint or gasp, only lowered her head. "I knew it," she said quietly. "I knew he could not have taken his own life, but I could not prove it." She confessed to hearing voices outside the study the night Ambrose died. 2 men in heated conversation. One voice she did not recognize. The other was Julian's. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Ah, the heir, the soldier, and the man with debts. She nodded slowly. But Julian swore to me he never entered the study, that he found our father already gone. And yet, Poirot said, his boots carried no mud, though the moor was soaked. He had not just arrived. He had never left. Julian, confronted, grew pale. Yes, he admitted. I argued with him. He refused to release trust funds. He accused me of cowardice during the war, but I didn't kill him. And the ledger? Poirot pressed. I took it. Yes, but only after. I was trying to destroy what he kept there. And what did it contain? I asked. He looked down. Names. Codes. Ambrose had blackmailed men during the war. Not for money, but for silence. There were things done, things never spoken of. Poirot's voice turned low. And did your father's conscience awaken in his final days? Julian's jaw clenched. He had begun writing letters to the families of those he'd ruined. Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then, and someone wished those letters never mailed. The next morning, we found the final piece, hidden inside an old war journal in the colonel's trunk. A letter and signed, written in shaky hand. I no longer believe in what we did. Raven's Nest was supposed to be salvation. We made it a gallows. I shall make amends or die trying. Poirot read it aloud as the family gathered. No one spoke. Then Eleanor March, the quiet cousin, stepped forward. He confessed to me, you know, she said, 3 days before he died. Said I was the only one who still looked at him without hatred. She looked up. Julian did not kill him, but he tried to bury the truth. And you? Poirot asked gently. I told him to do it, she whispered. To come clean. I believed the truth would heal. But now I'm not so sure. Poirot nodded slowly. Sometimes, mademoiselle, truth is both the cure and the wound. As we departed Ravenwell Hall beneath a gray sky, Hastings asked the question that still lingered. Do you believe justice was done, Poirot? Poirot paused, his hat in hand. No, Hastings. Not justice. Only clarity. The guilty live, and the innocent are not always spared. But perhaps the dead may rest easier now. He looked once more at the gray hall behind us, its windows lit faintly against the gloom. Let us go, mon ami. Ravenwell has given up its final whisper. The rain had a curious stillness that evening, falling like the memory of something once spoken, then forgotten. Venice shimmered beneath it, blurred at the edges, like a dream retreating from waking thought. A solitary gondola cut through the lagoon, its prow reflecting the light of an antique gas lamp. Inside it, under a violet umbrella, sat a woman in white gloves, her posture unyielding, her face obscured by a silk veil. At the dock of Hotel Carissimi, a lesser-known but richly historical palace, once owned by a minor branch of the Medici, stood Hercule Poirot, hands behind his back, mustaches neatly curled. He had not been invited to Venice, not formally, but a letter had come, unsigned, smelling faintly of lilacs, and written on translucent vellum. A riddle, no more, a single line. The glass orchid blooms beneath layers of gilt. Come before it withers. As the gondola docked and the woman stepped out, Poirot watched closely. Her walk was regal but hesitant. Her eyes, when she met his, carried the weight of something long endured. I believe you have been expecting me, she said softly. And yet, Poirot murmured, I suspect you are not the one who wrote the letter. She paused, only briefly. No, monsieur. That was my sister. Then I fear, said Poirot gravely, we are already too late. Hotel Carissimi had once been a convent. Its upper floors still bore traces of its past. Walls hung with faded frescoes of martyred saints, cloisters long silent. It was in one such wing, sealed from public use, that the tragedy was said to have occurred. The woman's name was Countess Anneliese von Ritter. She was Viennese nobility, recently widowed. Her sister, Clara, had been residing at the hotel for 3 months, researching the provenance of a rare sculpture, a supposedly cursed piece called the Glass Orchid. She had not been seen for 5 days. The room she'd occupied was untouched, locked from within, windows latched. No signs of struggle. Only the sculpture remained, perched on a velvet pedestal, an orchid, exquisitely sculpted in translucent Murano glass, its petals tinged red, as if weeping. Poirot inspected the room in silence, Hastings close behind. The air was heavy, scented with bergamot and dust. She left no note. "None," said the hotel manager. But there were noises. On the second night, screaming. Then silence. And no one entered? Impossible. Only one key. Poirot turned his gaze to the sculpture. "Then the lady vanished," he said, "in a room that could not be left, from a building no one entered. An illusion worthy of Whodunit, but with no applause at the end." In the days that followed, Poirot interviewed guests, an artist recovering from a breakdown, an English dowager obsessed with seances, a Russian pianist with trembling hands. Each gave accounts tinged in superstition. "The orchid weeps at night," the dowager claimed. "I saw her once in the corridor," said the pianist. "But when I followed, the hall was empty." Poirot remained unmoved. But a curious piece of information emerged. Clara had recently contacted a Venetian historian, a recluse named Giovanni Bellani, requesting records of a 17th-century fire that had consumed a monastery once occupying the site. Hastings was puzzled. "You think there's a connection?" Poirot only smiled. "Mon ami, in Venice, the past walks alongside us. It does not rest easily." They found Bellani in a crumbling villa filled with books and the scent of mildew. The man was old, his fingers ink-stained. "She was close," he muttered. "Too close. The orchid, it was not meant to be found." He handed Poirot a parchment, an inventory. It listed relics lost in the fire of 1624, including a glass sculpture described as Fiori del Peccato, the flower of sin. They said it captured the last breath of a penitent nun. Bellani whispered, her soul frozen in glass. Madness, perhaps, but beautiful madness. When they left, Hastings was pale. "You don't believe that nonsense, do you?" Poirot's brow furrowed. "No, but I believe Miss Clara von Ritter may have." That night, a storm descended upon Venice. The canal swelled. Lightning split the skies. In the darkened hallway outside the locked wing, Poirot stood motionless, listening. A soft tapping. Not footsteps, but the rhythmic tap of something hard like a cane, or a piece of glass on marble. He turned. The door to Clara's room stood open. They rushed in. The sculpture was gone. In its place, resting atop the velvet, lay a single white glove, and beside it, a torn scrap of paper. "I am not her. I never was." The next day, Poirot gathered all remaining guests in the grand salon. He asked no questions. He simply watched. It was the artist who broke. "I painted her," he whispered, "in the garden, but the shadows were wrong. She cast no shadow." Then the dowager. "There were voices in my room, whispering prayers, in Latin." Poirot turned to the Countess. "And you, madam, what truth have you hidden?" Her hands trembled. "She was not my sister," she said. "Not truly. We were orphans raised together, yes. But Clara, she changed after the orchid. She believed she remembered things, other lives, other deaths. She said the sculpture was a key." Poirot bowed his head. "And perhaps," he said gently, "she was right." They found the sculpture days later. It had been returned anonymously to the Basilica di Santa Maria della Salute. It now bore a new fracture, a single petal, cracked clean through. Inside the hollow of the stem was a rolled piece of vellum. Poirot read it in silence. Then, for the first time Hastings could remember, he wept. It was a confession, half poem, half lament. Clara had hidden herself, not from danger, but from identity. She believed she had once been Sister Benedetta, a nun burned in the fire of 1624 for treason and forbidden love. The sculpture, she wrote, had awakened her memory. She could no longer live in two times. Her final line, "The soul remembers what the mind forgets." I was not lost, I was returning. Venice was quiet when Poirot and Hastings departed. As the gondola pulled away, Hastings asked the question that had lingered in both their minds. "Do you think she was mad?" Poirot considered, then answered softly, "No, mon ami. I think she was haunted. And some hauntings come not from ghosts, but from truths too fragile to bear." He looked back at the city, its domes reflecting the rising sun. The glass orchid has bloomed and shattered, but in its breaking, it has told a story no courtroom would believe, yet every heart might understand. And with that, the gondola drifted forward, leaving the city of mirrors behind. It was the sort of twilight Venice reserves for stories of vanished saints and betrayed oaths. The wind whispered through the campaniles like a memory too fragile to speak aloud, and the water of the canal, untroubled yet restless, shimmered with the melancholy of old secrets. Hercule Poirot stood on the rotting jetty of Vigna della Luna, the neglected island once home to monks of a forgotten order. A private launch had delivered him and me, Captain Hastings, to this place at the request of Lady Annabel Westcombe, a woman both pale and feverishly driven, whose brother had disappeared a fortnight earlier. "He vanished within the chapel," she whispered as we made our way past shattered statues and bramble-choked fountains. No footprints, no sounds. The doors were bolted from the inside. Poirot said nothing, but I could see his mind turning, quietly, thoroughly. We reached the chapel just as the bells tolled 6. A hollow, reverberating sound, like a voice trying to remember its own name. The estate was once the summer retreat of Cardinal Ambrosi, whose taste for relics and reclusion had made Vigna della Luna famous in darker centuries. The chapel stood at the center like a heart whose beat had long ceased. Inside, the candle Lady Annabel had lit flickered uncertainly against crumbling frescoes. Her brother, Marcus Westcombe, had last been seen entering here alone. The locked door had revealed no tampering. The single stained glass window, depicting Saint Sebastian bound and serene in his torment, was far too narrow to permit escape. And yet, Marcus had vanished. Inspector Bellini of the Venetian Carabinieri scoffed. He fell into the lagoon. A madness overtook him. "Possibly," Poirot murmured. "But consider, madness leaves traces. This man left none. That evening, under the soft hiss of the rain, we dined with the remaining residents of the villa. There was Father Emiliano, the chaplain with eyes too old for his smooth, youthful face, Mr. Temple, the historian cataloguing the chapel's art, and Contessa di Orsini, with pearls that whispered against her collarbones as she moved. Marcus feared something. The Contessa confided after 2 glasses of Amaro. He told me the icon behind the altar had moved. Moved, I repeated. Not physically. Spiritually. He said it watched him. Poirot's brow furrowed, not in disbelief, but in focus. "And did you find him changed before his disappearance?" "Oh, yes," she whispered. He'd begun speaking of penance, of secrets his family could not afford to expose. The next day brought storms. We remained on the island, unable to leave even if we had wished. Poirot insisted we return to the chapel. There, he examined not just the architecture, but the acoustics. You see, Hastings, old chapels like this were designed to carry whispers. Confessions uttered here could be heard across the nave. We searched for hours. Then, Poirot paused near a cracked tile beside the altar. He knelt, tapping lightly until a hollow sound replied. A hidden compartment. Inside, we found a rusted iron key and a velvet pouch filled with uncut emeralds. Poirot did not smile. Stolen from the Cathedral of Brescia in 1797. Looted in the chaos after Napoleon's retreat. How the devil did they get here? That, Hastings, is the question that ties Marcus Westcombe to a secret buried over a century. Father Emiliano confessed by candlelight. I did not know what Marcus had found until it was too late. He came to me one night, white with terror, speaking of a journal hidden by the cardinal himself, a ledger of confessions, bribes, and holy artifacts stolen and sold through secret channels. And this ledger, Poirot asked, still exists? Marcus believed so. He said he would uncover it, even if it destroyed his name. Temple interrupted us then. He didn't care about reputation. He cared about Annabel. He wanted her free of their family's guilt. So he vanished himself, I suggested. Poirot shook his head. Not yet, Hastings. We are still at the surface. Late that night, Poirot asked us to join him in the chapel once more. By candlelight, the painted icon seemed to shift. Notice, Poirot said, the positioning of the saint's eyes. They follow not the faithful, but the floor. With a crowbar borrowed from the villa's tool room, he pried open the marble beneath the icon. A stone staircase spiraled down into darkness. The air was thick with damp and incense long faded. And at the bottom, Marcus Westcombe, alive, pale, gaunt, clutching the cardinal's lost ledger. Marcus had hidden himself, convinced he was being watched, not by men, but by fate itself. He feared what the truth would do to Annabel. They will destroy her, he croaked. Our family laundered relics through false donations. My father was the worst of them. Poirot knelt beside him. Monsieur, you have suffered for a past not entirely your own. But this darkness, it must now be shared. When the storm broke and the boat came, we returned to Venice, with the ledger secured. Inspector Bellini, skeptical to the end, grudgingly acknowledged Poirot's genius. Lady Annabel held her brother's hand in silence. It was not forgiveness, but understanding. And Poirot, standing at the edge of the dock as the sun gilded the water, said to me, Hastings, there are crimes of greed, and crimes of violence, but the most dangerous are those of conscience, for they wear the mask of virtue. It was not the letter that caught my attention that morning, but the faint scent of lavender that clung to it, a lingering perfume that seemed too delicate for the heavy parchment on which it was written. We were seated in the lounge of the Villa Fiorenzia, overlooking the mist-shrouded waters of Lake Como, when the concierge approached with the envelope. Poirot took it with a slight nod, the arch of his eyebrow already forming the first question. A distress call, mon ami, he murmured after reading it, folding the letter with exact precision. We are invited to a chapel. A most curious invitation, n'est-ce pas? The letter came from an old acquaintance, the Marchesa Evelina d'Orsi, a woman of considerable reputation and even greater wealth. She wrote of strange occurrences at her family estate, Vigna della Luna, a former monastery perched upon the cliffs overlooking the lake, now converted into a private residence. Whispers in the chapel at night, a bell that tolled though no rope was drawn, and worst of all, the sudden and unexplained death of her son, Tommaso, a painter of tormented genius. By evening, we were aboard the lake ferry, shrouded in a deepening fog that seemed to swallow the world whole. It was the kind of night when silence itself felt like an omen. The estate loomed out of the mist like something from a forgotten time. All ivy-choked towers, shuttered windows, and stone angels worn faceless by centuries of rain. We were met by a man who introduced himself as Padre Johnny, the estate's resident chaplain, a stooped figure in a threadbare cassock. He seemed more ghost than man. You've come to find what hides in shadows, he said to Poirot, with a gaze both sharp and sorrowful. But beware, signore. Some shadows are not meant for light. Inside, the chapel was colder than the air outside. Beneath its vaulted ceilings, frescoes of saints and martyrs wept crimson tears, faded with time, and yet disturbingly vivid in the dying candlelight. Poirot stood beneath the bell tower and listened, as though the stones themselves might confess. That night, the bell rang once, a single mournful toll that woke the household. But when we climbed the spiral staircase to the bell tower, we found no one. The mechanism was untouched, a mystery that announces itself, Poirot said softly. But let us not be hasty. Even ghosts must have motives. In Tommaso's studio, the air smelled of turpentine and dried roses. Canvases leaned against every wall, wild with color and fury, most featuring the same pale woman, with hollow eyes and a scar beneath her collarbone. Evelina told us she did not know her. He claimed she visited him in dreams, she whispered. But I found footprints on the studio floor, even when it was locked. Padre Johnny grew more agitated by the hour. He objected to our questions, warning us to leave the dead alone. Tommaso was cursed by vanity, by obsession. He summoned his end through sacrilege. Poirot examined the bell tower again. Not sacrilege, mon père, but perhaps a masquerade. That evening, As the fog wrapped the villa in its suffocating embrace, Poirot requested to dine with the entire household. Present were the Marchesa, Padre Johnny, the gardener Matteo, the maid Lucia, and Evelina's niece, Bianca, a young woman with a trembling voice and a keen intellect. "Something is missing," Poirot murmured as he stirred his soup. "Not something visible, but someone who should be." At dawn, Matteo discovered claw marks on the crypt door behind the chapel, fresh, as though someone had been trying to get in or out. Poirot insisted we enter, despite the protests of the padre. The crypt was dry, its air stale with incense and decay. But it was not empty. Near the altar lay a torn scarf. Beside it, an overturned candelabrum and traces of blood. "Who has access to this place?" Poirot asked. "Only myself," Padre Johnny replied, "and Tommaso when he was alive." "Then we must consider," Poirot said, "that death may not have ended his movements." The statue of the Madonna in the courtyard had been defaced. Her face was smashed, and at her feet someone had left a withered bouquet and a letter addressed to Evelina. "Your sins will rise," it read. "As you buried me, so shall I return." Poirot gathered the household in the drawing room. Tension crackled like a storm. "Secrets have weight," he began. "They crack plaster. They toll bells. They kill." He turned to Evelina. "Your son was not insane. He saw something, or someone, and he painted her. Again and again. A woman you claim not to know. But there's more to you, Marchesa, than grief." She paled. It was never meant to go this far. Poirot pieced it together from details too subtle for any but his eye. The identical scar scene in paintings, a photograph hidden in Evelina's jewelry case, and an old convent record. "Her name was Sister Immaculata," he revealed. "Once your maid, then your brother's lover. When she became inconvenient, she was sent away, to the convent that once occupied this villa. But she never left. She died here, and someone has taken up her cause." Bianca, trembling, stood up. "She was my mother." Gasps rippled through the room. "You lied to me," she said to Evelina. "My whole life." That night, Poirot kept vigil in the chapel. At precisely 1 in the morning, the bell tolled, and he moved. Following the sound not upward, but downward, he opened a hidden passage beneath the altar. There, in a room lined with forgotten bones, stood Padre Johnny. "You rang the bell," Poirot said. "To summon justice," the priest replied. "Or vengeance." Johnny confessed. He had been the one to lure Tommaso to the crypt. The boy had discovered too much. He had begun to dig, both metaphorically and literally. He had found Immaculata's name in the chapel records, had painted her face to memory. He had to be silenced. "You call it justice," Poirot said, "but I call it murder." Johnny was taken away. Evelina wept not just for her son, but for her sins. Bianca left the villa that morning, her head high, the fog breaking at last. Poirot and I walked along the cliff edge, where the chapel bell no longer rang. Birds circled the lake, and sunlight broke across the water. "You see, Hastings," Poirot said, "truth, like a bell, cannot stay silent forever. It waits, sometimes centuries, but eventually it tolls." It was in the early weeks of autumn, when the vineyards of Umbria glowed with the last golden fire of the harvest, that Hercule Poirot received an invitation most unexpected. The card, thick and cream-colored, bore a crimson wax seal and a single line in looping Italian script. "Your presence is humbly requested at Vigna della Luna." There was no signature, no explanation, but it was the name that struck a chord. Vigna della Luna was a secluded villa near the hill town of Montefalco, known more to art historians and cryptographers than to tourists. It was said to be built in the ruins of a medieval monastery whose underground chapel had been sealed for centuries, its frescoes rumored to contain a forgotten heresy, a blasphemous code. The villa now belonged to Contessa Bianca Ravello, widow of the controversial art theorist Luca Ravello, who had died under enigmatic circumstances the previous year, reportedly from a fall down the grand staircase. But Poirot was not summoned for an anniversary, nor a consultation on art. The letter that followed, written in delicate ink by the Contessa herself, hinted at a deeper mystery, I believe my husband did not die by accident. I believe he was silenced. Please come before they do the same to me." Poirot arrived at Vigna della Luna, beneath a sky bruised with violet. The villa rose before him like a ghost unearthed, its stones silvered by age, its windows shaded by drawn velvet. Inside, the Contessa waited, veiled in black, her figure slight, but regal. Her eyes, lined with worry, flicked to the corners of the room, as though fearing the walls might listen. "My husband," she said, her voice trembling, was on the verge of revealing something terrible. He had found a code in the chapel beneath this house, a cipher hidden in the frescoes. He said it would change everything we know about certain Renaissance masters, that it would expose a falsification on a grand scale. Then he fell. Poirot's brow creased. "And you believe someone pushed him?" "I believe he was murdered," she replied simply, and the chapel was sealed again the very next day. She handed Poirot a small object, a rosary made not of wood, but of intricately carved bone. Its cross bore the emblem of a black sun. That evening, Poirot dined with the other guests. Signor Emilio Bertani, a financier and patron of the arts, Sister Maria Valente, a Dominican nun and former student of Ravello's, and Lorenzo De Luca, a young cryptographer employed by the Italian Ministry of Culture. The air was thick with politeness and veiled glances. As wine was poured and the oil lamps flickered, Poirot studied his companions. Bertani spoke at length about the value of authenticity in art. Sister Maria deflected any mention of Ravello's research, her hands clutching a crucifix with visible strain. Lorenzo remained mostly silent, his dark eyes betraying a mind in turmoil. Later that night, Poirot walked the vineyards under moonlight. A shadow passed between the rows, quick, furtive. He followed it only to find the chapel door ajar, despite being sealed by iron lock. A chill crept over him as he stepped closer and saw, etched into the stone just beside the threshold, the symbol of the black sun. The next morning, under Poirot's insistence, the old chapel was unsealed. The air that issued forth was stale with centuries, but it was not empty. Beneath the altar, a passage descended into darkness, lined with frescoes that twisted traditional biblical scenes into grotesque inversions. One showed the Madonna weeping as angels fed pages of scripture into a burning pyre. Another depicted the Christ figure reaching not for heaven, but for a chalice held by a shadowed figure with no face. It was Lorenzo who first spoke. "These are not heretical," he murmured. "They're encrypted. Look, the halos are composed of musical notation. The folds in the robes, geometric sequences. This is a code." Poirot nodded gravely. A code, or a confession. That night, Sister Maria was found collapsed in the library, an empty bottle of sedative at her side, and a note clutched in her hand. She survived, barely, and upon waking confessed to Poirot. "Luca," he told me what he found. I begged him to stop. He believed the Church had falsified certain manuscripts during the Council of Trent, replacing ancient Gospels with sanitized versions. He said some great families were complicit, financiers, cardinals, even Renaissance artists. He was going to name names. Poirot pressed gently. "And you?" I feared for him, for all of us. I said too much to someone I thought I could trust. The next day, he was dead. A breakthrough came when Poirot examined Ravello's personal sketchbook. Hidden between two glued pages was a letter, addressed to the Contessa, containing not accusations but apologies. It referenced the Benedict cipher and the illegitimate crucifixion, a painting Ravello believed to be a forgery hanging in the Uffizi, attributed falsely to a student of Caravaggio. That painting, he claimed, was the key. The cipher and the chapel matched symbols in its background. Together, they revealed a pattern of forged provenance stretching across 3 centuries. Then Lorenzo vanished. They found Lorenzo's body in the well behind the vineyard, his hands bound, his lips blue from hemlock. The only clue, a torn page from Ravello's notebook tucked into his shirt. It read simply, "They still watch. They still kill." Poirot gathered the guests in the drawing room that evening, the air heavy with dread. "I believe," he said, "that the murder of Luca Ravello, and now poor Lorenzo, are the result of a conspiracy not only to protect a secret, but to profit from it. A secret so dangerous, so destabilizing, that even centuries later, its shadow looms. Brittany stood livid. "Are you accusing me?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "I am stating that Ravello traced his findings to certain families, and your family, Signor Brittany, profited handsomely from the very artworks whose origin was falsified. Your fortune was built on a lie." Brittany was arrested that same night, his guilt confirmed when the authorities uncovered a collection of forged ledgers hidden in his Roman townhouse. They traced decades of art smuggling and falsification, aided by corrupt officials and bought historians. But it was the Contessa who delivered the most haunting blow. She chose to donate the entire estate of Vigna della Luna to the state, with one condition: the chapel would remain sealed. "It is a place of truth," she told Poirot, "but also of pain. Let it rest." Poirot, gazing one last time upon the black sun etched in stone, murmured, "Sometimes, madam, justice is not in the unveiling, but in the decision to leave some shadows undisturbed." The wind carried the scent of crushed grapes and ancient dust. Poirot bowed his head. "Come, Hastings," he said. "The harvest is done." The letter arrived in the second week of April, as spring began to soften the sharp edges of a long winter. It came on cream stationery bearing the faded crest of the Marchese di Roviano, postmarked from a remote village in southern Tuscany. Hercule Poirot, whose daily routine rarely allowed for surprises, regarded it with polite curiosity before opening it with his silver letter opener. The handwriting was elegant, if trembling. The Marchesa Leonora di Roviano, it read, requested the discreet counsel of Monsieur Poirot in a matter she could not fully disclose in writing. Her family's chapel, a crumbling medieval structure set upon the cliffs above the village of Vigna della Luna, had become the source of local legend and whispered fear. Something ancient had awakened, and someone, she feared, was about to die. Poirot, ever intrigued by the intersection of myth and motive, agreed to travel. I, Captain Arthur Hastings, accompanied him. Little did we know we were entering a mystery steeped not only in old blood, but in older sins. Vigna della Luna was less a village than a suggestion. Its narrow lanes sloped between centuries-old stone buildings, overgrown with ivy and the fragrance of early wisteria. The townspeople watched us arrive with guarded eyes. The Marchese's villa loomed above the hamlet, graceful but weary, its windows blinking slowly against the descending dusk. We were greeted by Pietro, the Marchese's steward, who led us past worn frescoes and echoing corridors into a drawing-room dim with age. There sat the Marchesa herself, an exquisite relic of nobility and resolve. She spoke of the chapel in hushed tones, as if to name it too loudly would awaken something. It had been closed for decades, but weeks ago, a caretaker was found inside dead, seemingly from fright. A locked door, no signs of struggle. The priest who now resided in the village, Father Benedetto, had refused to set foot in it again. The Marchesa feared the past was returning, and this time it would not remain buried. We visited the chapel the next morning. It crouched at the edge of a cliff, its facade cracked like old bone. A faded fresco of the Madonna watched over its doors, worn by rain and years. Inside, the air was chill and heavy. The scent of myrrh lingered faintly. Poirot examined the stone floor, the pews, the ornate but dust-veiled altar. "A place of worship, yes," he murmured, "but also of secrecy." In the vestry, we found signs of a makeshift living space, the caretaker's. A narrow cot, a diary in brittle leather. The last entries grew erratic. Mentions of voices, of a child in the walls, of footsteps when none should walk. And always, always, the final word repeated, "Forgive." Professor Gabriele Fontana, an art historian from Florence, arrived that afternoon. He had been summoned by the Marchesa to appraise the chapel's frescoes, particularly one recently uncovered behind a rotted panel. The figure depicted was no saint, a skeletal child with golden eyes and a bleeding heart, reaching toward a weeping nun. "This is not Christian iconography," Fontana said, troubled. "This is folk memory, something much older." That night, the chapel's bell rang out across the valley, yet none had touched its rope in decades. We descended into the crypt. Poirot's torch swept over damp stone, forgotten tombs, and iron gates rusted with age. Behind one, the bones of a child, clothed in a disintegrating white habit, hands clasped in prayer. Poirot knelt, silent. This was no burial, he said at last. This was containment. A locket lay beneath the child's ribs. Inside, a painting. The Marchesa, young, radiant, and a child with golden eyes. Father Benedetto had been avoiding us, but Poirot's insistence bore fruit. The priest received us in his study, his hands trembling. She was my sister, he whispered. Leonora's twin. They called her cursed. She saw things. Spoke of sins no child could know. One night she set fire to the sacristy. The elders panicked. The bishop gave permission, an exorcism, they said. She did not survive. And the body? They sealed her below. Told the villagers she had died of illness. But the guilt, it lingers, as do the lies. That evening, during a formal dinner to honor Fontana's restoration, a scream split the courtyard. Professor Fontana was found collapsed in the chapel doorway, blood seeping from a wound to his chest. He lived, but barely. In his delirium, he spoke of a figure in white, eyes glowing, whispering his name. Poirot gathered us in the drawing room. The Marchesa, Pietro, Father Benedetto, even the skeptical Mayor Russo. The ghost, he said calmly, is very much alive. And then he revealed the key. The painting in the locket, a forgery. The fresco, a deliberate modern edition. The whispers, amplified through hidden tubes from the crypt. Someone was staging terror. But why? To drive out the Marchesa, to claim the land, and the art beneath the chapel. He turned to Pietro, the steward who knew too much, who poisoned the professor before he could reveal the truth, but also who tried to silence the past with fear. Pietro confessed, weeping. His family had long served the Marchesi, but greed and resentment festered. He discovered the fresco fragment, learned of ancient Etruscan relics buried beneath the chapel, and planned to sell them through illicit channels. Poirot ensured his arrest. The artifacts were safeguarded by the local authorities. Father Benedetto announced he would resign, returning to a monastery to seek atonement. Before leaving Vigna della Luna, Poirot returned once more to the chapel. He stood before the crypt. She was silenced because she saw the truth, he said softly. But in the end, she became the truth, and the lie crumbled before her. As we left, the sea whispered far below, and the sun crowned the chapel in a halo of gold. On the train to Florence, Poirot reflected. The past, mon ami, does not rest. We bury it, we paint over it, we rename it, but still it waits, until someone, often the innocent, pays its price. And in the chapel at Vigna della Luna, justice had finally rung out, like a bell in the night.